nor were they to spill blood. They couldn't be surgeons, they couldn't go to war, they couldn't hunt. Although since we're dealing with law, there's always a way around that, isn't there? When a bishop went to war, he didn't carry a sword in case he, such as for instance Bishop Turpin in the Song of Roland, he didn't carry a sword in case he spilt blood. He carried instead a mace, so he bashed your brains out. That was special for the bishops. And as for spilling blood in hunting, I'm reminded of the story of an Archbishop of Canterbury in the early 19th century who was invited to a shooting party at a country home, and he went out and unfortunately he shot a beater and shot him dead. And the penalty for that in canon law was quite severe. Now the problem here is that the Ecclesia Anglicana had reformed itself on many fronts, on liturgy, on Bible, on the lifestyles of the clergy, but they never got round to canon law, and they were still under the medieval canon law, and the penalty for killing a man spilling his blood was, if you were a cleric, was that you couldn't perform any sacramental duties. You were forbidden from sacred rites. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury was in a terrible bind. Why? Well, the normal thing you do there was go to someone superior and get absolved from this. But who was superior to the Archbishop of Canterbury? Well, when the law was written, there was a man called the Pope, but it would have been rather strange in the 19th century for the Archbishop of Canterbury to apply to the Pope for absolution. When the King heard about this, that the Archbishop wasn't doing his work, he said, "Oh, don't be bloody silly, go back to work." There's always a way around. You may think all this is ancient history, but clericalism survived in these ways right down to our own times. Certainly, I knew men who had their hair tonsured. I knew people who didn't go into pubs. Let me tell you a story that when I first went to study overseas, a young priest from the Liverpool diocese said, "How are you finding it here in England after Australia?" I said, "Well, it's a bit different. Of course, I understand you don't go into pubs." "Oh, no, wouldn't go into pubs." I said, "Well, yes, it's a bit like that at home, but of course, if you want to have a drink, you take your collar off." "Good heavens, that'd be worse," he said. However, I wasn't committed to 3 dry years. When a man turned up a few days later who was to become my best friend, and I told him that story, he said simply, "Are you doing anything at the moment? Put on your jacket." He took me down to the Rose and Crown and got me a pint. So Kieran's book is a very important uncovering of one of the secrets of clericalism, and we're going to hear from him now. He had to stop writing it, of course, but the problems go on. We're all aware of the Royal Commission, and we'll be expecting another book from you, Kieran, on that. The Royal Commission is clearly going to need some serious work, scholarship quickened by journalism. Let me just say that on the Royal Commission on Monday the 24th of March, I watched Cardinal Pell being questioned in the Royal Commission, and I woke up at 4:40 the next morning and thought, it's too disgusting the way he threw his men to the wolves to protect himself. I thought of his men, John Davern, John Usher, Michael Casey, and I'm sure those who write about the Royal Commission will be giving that particular ineptitude a lot of coverage. And so we launch Kieran's book. It remains me only to congratulate ATF, particularly Hilary Regan, to congratulate the Veech Library for making this meeting possible, and most of all, to congratulate the author of the book, Kieran Tapsell, the book which I now launch.
Ladies and gentlemen, gentlemen, thank you firstly all for coming, and thank you David and Ed for your very kind words. When I was in the seminary back in the late 60s, I realised that the most boring subject that I had ever studied in my whole life was canon law. If anyone had told me back in 1967 that 45 years later I would have returned to the study of canon law, I would have told them they needed their head ready. But when you are looking for something, even a telephone book can be riveting. And 6 years ago, I started looking for something. Quite by accident, I came across a website called Broken Rights. And I saw that it was about the clergy sexual abuse of children. And in my former life, I knew quite a lot of clergy, so I thought I'd better check out to see if I recognised any names. And I recognised all too many of them. The most notorious of them was Father Jim Fletcher from Newcastle, who died in jail, and he was in my class. But I saw another name there which really intrigued me. Not because he'd been sexually abusing children, but because it was alleged that he had been covering it up. He was one of my seminary professors, and he'd become a bishop. And he was a man I admired immensely. In fact, I admired him more than any other member of the faculty. And I thought to myself, why did this good man do that? And Father Frank Brennan recently asked the same thing about Archbishop Little of Melbourne. Then I started discovering that this behaviour of bishops was the same all over the world. You could not explain that by conspiracy theories. You could not explain that by bad apples in the barrel. These men really had to believe that they were doing the right thing. And I suspected it had to have something to do with canon law. So I bought myself something that looks like a telephone book, the new commentary on the Code of Canon Law, and I started working through both it and other papal decrees. Not all canon law is in the Code. There are other papal decrees which are still part of canon law. And I discovered that until 1917, canon law required priests who sexually abused children to be dismissed from the priesthood and then to be handed over to the civil authorities for punishment according to the civil law. In 1904, Pope St. Pius X decided he would put some order into the 10,000 decrees which formed canon law, and which, of course, as you can imagine, over 2,000 years, 1,900 years, a lot of them were self-contradictory. A lot of them, like, for example, the decrees against usury, charging interest, were no longer applicable. And some of them were positively embarrassing, like the 50 anti-Semitic papal bulls.